Josh McKenzie had never been the kind of man to start trouble. He had lived in the same modest house for nearly 15 years, kept to himself, and took care of what was his. His home was his sanctuary, a place he had put countless hours into maintaining. As a mechanic, he had a natural inclination for fixing things, making them stronger, more resilient. His front yard was no exception. The neatly trimmed hedges lining the edge of his property were more than just decorative. They were a boundary, a symbol of the order and effort he put into his life. He had planted them himself, nurtured them through rough winters and scorching summers, shaped them with careful precision. They stood as a living testament to his patience, his control over his space in a world that often felt unpredictable. And then, one morning, he woke up to find them ruined. At first, he thought it might have been an accident. Maybe some careless driver had misjudged the curve, clipped the edge, and kept going without realizing the destruction. But when it happened again, a few days later, the tire tracks cutting deep into the soil, snapping branches, and uprooting entire sections, he knew it was intentional. Someone was doing this on purpose. The question was why. Josh spent the next week trying to catch the culprit. He adjusted his routine, waking up earlier, staying up later, watching from his porch with a quiet determination. But the damage always happened when he wasn't looking. A late-night trip to the store, a momentary distraction, and another section of his hedge would be destroyed. He spoke to his neighbors, but no one had seen anything. The people across the street were either too busy with their own lives or just didn't want to get involved. Even Mrs. Davis, the elderly woman who spent most of her time on her front porch, simply shook her head when he asked if she had seen anything. "They come when it's dark," she said. "Quick, like they don't want to be caught." That was when he started finding pieces of plastic and metal among the broken branches. Small fragments, nothing immediately recognizable, but enough for a man who worked on cars for a living to identify. Whoever was running over his hedge wasn't driving a standard sedan. This was a heavier vehicle, something reinforced. And they weren't just skimming the edge. They were plowing through with force, with intent. Josh went to the local board hoping for some assistance, but was met with nothing but red tape and dismissive responses. "It's probably just some kids messing around," one of the representatives told him, barely looking up from his paperwork. "Maybe you should consider moving your hedge back a bit." That was when it clicked. They wanted him to move it. Someone, somewhere, wanted that boundary gone. The hedge wasn't just an annoyance to some reckless driver. It was an obstacle. But to what? Josh had spent enough time fixing problems to know when he needed to shift strategies. If they wanted his hedge gone, they were going to have to try a lot harder. He reinforced the base, embedding steel rods within the soil, securing the roots with heavy stones beneath the surface. It wasn't visible to the naked eye, but the next time someone tried to drive through it, they'd be in for a nasty surprise. The night after he finished reinforcing the hedge, he didn't bother watching. He went to bed as usual, knowing that if they came again, they wouldn't be leaving unscathed. And sure enough, sometime after midnight, he woke to the unmistakable sound of metal screeching against something unyielding, followed by a dull, heavy thud. By the time he reached his front door, the taillights of a black SUV were vanishing down the street, leaving behind a fresh set of deep tire marks and a piece of shattered headlight casing. This time, he had them. He picked up the casing, turning it over in his hands. He knew exactly what model it belonged to. It wasn't just any SUV. It was an armored one, expensive, custom-fitted, the kind that belonged to someone with money and connections. The kind that shouldn't have any reason to be driving through a suburban hedge in the dead of night. Josh didn't waste time. The next day, he made a few calls, checking in with some friends who ran repair shops around town. Just as he suspected, someone had come in that morning looking for a replacement headlight for a black, reinforced SUV. And that someone wasn't just a random vandal. It was Danny Wells, a contractor with deep ties to local developments. The same Danny Wells who had been in talks to push through new road expansions that just so happened to run right through Josh's neighborhood. That was the moment everything became clear. They weren't just messing with him. They were testing him, seeing if he would give up, if he would make it easy for them. But they had underestimated him. Josh didn't report it. He didn't make threats. He simply waited. He knew they would come again, and when they did, he'd be ready. This wasn't just about a hedge anymore. It was about control, about standing his ground. And if they thought they could intimidate him into compliance, they were about to learn just how wrong they were. For the next few days, he acted as if nothing had happened. He kept to his usual routine, made small talk with the neighbors, and continued working on cars at his shop. But each night, he stayed up late, his tools lined up neatly on his workbench, his mind running through possible scenarios. He knew they would be back. 3 nights later, he was proven right. Around 2 a.m., the distant rumble of an engine approached. He stood in the darkened living room, watching through the blinds as the same black SUV slowed to a crawl in front of his house. It hesitated, almost as if the driver was reconsidering, then accelerated forward. This time, the impact was different. There was no clean cut through the hedge, no effortless plowing through like before. The steel reinforcements and hidden concrete barriers did their job. The SUV slammed into an unmovable force, the front end crunching inward with a sickening screech of metal. A loud curse echoed in the night as the driver threw the door open. Josh stepped onto his porch, arms crossed, watching as Danny Wells himself stumbled out of the vehicle. His face twisted in pain and rage. The man was clutching his wrist, probably injured from the sudden stop. But what caught Josh's attention was the small duffel bag that had spilled out of the passenger seat. Even in the dim streetlights, he could see the stacks of paperwork, documents, and something that looked a hell of a lot like blueprints. "Son of a," Danny muttered, kicking the damaged vehicle. His rage turned to something else, fear, when he noticed Josh standing there. Josh tilted his head slightly. Having car trouble? Danny glared but didn't answer. He was already pulling out his phone, probably calling someone to come pick him up. Josh didn't move. He let the silence stretch between them, let Danny stew in the knowledge that he had been caught. Not by the police, not by some reporter, but by the one guy he thought would be easy to push over. That's when Josh made his decision. He wasn't going to the authorities. He wasn't going to file a complaint. No, this was bigger than that. If they wanted to play dirty, he was more than ready. Josh woke up early the next morning, still replaying the events of the previous night in his mind. The image of Danny Wells standing beside his wrecked SUV, cursing under his breath, was burned into his memory. The damage to the vehicle had been substantial: crumpled hood, shattered headlight, and a leaking radiator. The bastard had learned the hard way that Josh wasn't just going to roll over. But that wasn't what stuck with him the most. It was the duffel bag that had spilled open, the stacks of documents and blueprints inside. Josh had spent enough time around construction workers and contractors to recognize blueprints when he saw them. They hadn't been related to any simple road expansion or public project. Those were private plans, something that wasn't meant to be seen by just anyone. And Danny had reacted fast, too fast, scrambling to shove the papers back into the bag like a man protecting a secret. That's when Josh knew for certain this wasn't just about him. He poured himself a cup of coffee, sat at the kitchen table, and started thinking about his next move. Going to the authorities was out of the question. People like Danny Wells didn't operate without covering their tracks, and if he was involved in something shady, odds were good that he had enough influence to make any official complaints disappear before they even reached the right desk. No, Josh needed to figure out what was happening on his own, at least enough to know what he was dealing with. The first step was information. He spent the afternoon making some calls, reaching out to a few old contacts who had worked in construction and land development. He kept the conversation casual, just a guy looking to stay informed. Eventually, he got what he needed. There had been rumors circulating for a while now, whispers about a private real estate deal happening under the table, a new development project, something big. But nothing had been officially announced. The only people who seemed to know the details were those who had direct ties to the contractors involved. One name kept coming up: Wells Development Group, Danny's company. Josh sat back in his chair, exhaling slowly. If Danny was pushing for some kind of major real estate deal, it made sense that he would want Josh out of the way. His property was an obstacle, the last privately owned lot standing in the way of whatever was being planned. That explained the intimidation tactics. First, they tried to make his life miserable, hoping he would cave and move out. When that didn't work, they escalated to actively destroying his property. And now, after last night, he had physically cost them money. Josh chuckled to himself. He bet Danny wasn't happy about that. By late afternoon, he decided it was time to take a drive. He had noticed something strange the night before, the way Danny had immediately checked his phone after crashing into the hedge. It wasn't just a call for help. He had been texting someone, updating them. That meant there was someone else in this equation, someone Danny reported to. Josh knew exactly where to start looking. He drove across town to a commercial district where Wells Development Group had an office. It wasn't a flashy high-rise, just a modest brick building with tinted windows and a logo slapped onto the glass door. Josh parked a block away, sitting in his truck, watching. After about 30 minutes, he spotted Danny's SUV, or what was left of it. The front end was still wrecked, but it was parked in the lot behind the building. He wasn't alone. A black luxury sedan sat next to it, the kind of car only people with real money drove. Josh watched as a man in a dark suit stepped out of the sedan and walked into the building without even glancing around. There was something about the way he moved, confident like someone who wasn't used to being questioned. Whoever he was important. Josh didn't need to get closer to know what was happening. Danny was reporting to someone bigger than him, someone who didn't just want Josh's hedge gone, but his entire property. For the first time, Josh felt something different from frustration or anger. He felt curiosity, and curiosity could be dangerous. The next few days were tense. Josh knew better than to make himself an obvious problem, so he kept his head down, waiting to see what they would do next. He didn't have to wait long. On Tuesday morning, an official-looking letter arrived in his mailbox. The return address, Wells Development Group. Josh tore it open and skimmed the contents. It was a buyout offer, a generous one, too, far more than his property was actually worth. But the wording of the letter wasn't friendly. It was cold, clinical, filled with legal jargon that made it clear this wasn't just a request. It was an expectation. They wanted him gone. Immediately. He set the letter down, rubbing his jaw. They were done playing games. That night, Josh was in his garage, working on an old carburetor, when he heard footsteps outside. Slow, deliberate, not the casual stride of someone passing by. He killed the light and moved to the side of the garage door, his heart pounding in his chest. He had a crowbar nearby, not because he was expecting trouble, but because old habits die hard. Then a thump. Something hit the side of his house. Josh stayed still, listening. Another thump, this time closer to the front door. Whoever was out there wasn't just walking past. He stepped silently toward the door, his grip tightening on the crowbar. He didn't want to fight, but he also wasn't about to let someone corner him in his own house. Then, silence. He waited a full minute before cautiously cracking the door open. The night was still. The street, empty. But when he looked down, there was a brick on his porch, a note tied around it with twine. Josh bent down, unwrapping the paper. There was no signature, no company letterhead. Just 6 handwritten words. You should take the money, McKenzie. Josh exhaled slowly, his pulse steady. They had finally shown their hand, and he was going to break every single one of their fingers. Josh stood on his porch, the note in his hand, his jaw tightening as he reread the words. A brick through his window would have been a threat, but this was worse. This was them telling him they were in control, that he should see the writing on the wall and get out before things escalated further. He let out a slow breath, crumpled the note in his fist, and went back inside. If they thought he was the kind of man to be scared off that easily, they had another thing coming. He locked the door, grabbed a beer from the fridge, and sat at his kitchen table, thinking. He knew what was coming next. The damage to his hedge had been the start. The buyout offer had been a formality. And now, they were moving into direct intimidation. That meant he had little time before they took the next step, whatever that might be. He spent the next morning reinforcing his property, not in the obvious way that would signal he was expecting trouble, but in subtle ways that would make their next move much harder. He replaced the screws on his front and back doors with longer ones, reinforced the frames, and adjusted the motion sensors on his outdoor lights to trigger more easily. Then he checked his garage, making sure nothing had been tampered with. His tools were all where they should be, but something fell off, like the air had been disturbed. He went over to his truck, popped the hood, and felt a wave of rage bubble up in his chest when he saw it. The fuel line had been slit. A clean, precise cut that would have gone unnoticed until he was driving. If he hadn't checked, the truck could have stalled on the highway. Or worse, he stepped back, breathing deeply, controlling the anger burning through him. This was bigger than a land dispute now. This was them trying to send a message, trying to make it clear that they could reach into his life whenever they wanted. He had spent enough time around guys who played dirty to know that the worst thing he could do now was react emotionally. He needed to be smart. The cops wouldn't do anything. Hell, for all he knew, some of them were in on whatever was happening. He had to handle this himself, but he couldn't just go in swinging. He needed to draw them out, make them slip up, force them to show their hand before they realized he was playing a different game. That night, he sat in his darkened living room, watching the street, waiting. He knew they would come back. They had already damaged his property, tried to scare him into leaving, and now they had sabotaged his truck. This wasn't just about money anymore. It was about power. The longer he held out, the more desperate they would become. Around 2 a.m., a pair of headlights appeared at the far end of the road. The vehicle slowed as it approached his house, rolling to a silent stop near the curb. Josh stayed still, watching through the blinds, waiting for them to make their move. The driver's door opened, and a man in a hooded jacket stepped out. He wasn't carrying a weapon, at least not one that was visible, but his movements were careful, deliberate. He walked to the edge of Josh's property, glanced around, then reached into his pocket. Josh tensed as the man pulled out a small canister and shook it. Spray paint. The bastard was going to vandalize his house, mark it as a final warning before things got even worse. Josh didn't wait. He moved fast, yanking the door open and stepping onto the porch before the man even realized he had been spotted. The guy froze, his hand halfway to the wall. Josh didn't say a word. He just stared. The man hesitated, then took a step back, clearly rethinking his choices. "Get off my property," Josh said, his voice calm, but carrying an edge that left no room for argument. The man swallowed, dropping the spray paint as he took another step backward. He wasn't a fighter, that much was clear. He was just a pawn, sent to send a message, but now realizing he had been played. Josh took a slow step forward, forcing the man to retreat further until he turned and sprinted for the car. The driver, likely Danny or one of his associates, gunned the engine, and the tires squealed as they sped off into the night. Josh stood on his porch, listening to the sound fade into the distance. They weren't done, not by a long shot, but now they knew he wasn't just going to sit back and take it. They had made their play. Now it was his turn. Josh picked up the discarded spray paint can, turning it over in his hands, an idea already forming in his mind. They wanted to intimidate him, mark his property, send a message. Fine, but they had no idea who they were messing with. He wasn't just going to sit back and wait for the next attack. He was going to take the fight to them. The next morning, he made a few stops, picking up supplies from a local hardware store. He wasn't looking for weapons. He was looking for leverage. By that evening, he was ready. He drove across town, stopping a block away from the Wells Development Group's office. The same black SUV was parked in the lot, now repaired but still carrying the scars of its last encounter with his Hedge. Josh smiled to himself. He grabbed his bag, stepped out of his truck, and moved quickly, staying in the shadows. He worked fast, keeping low, checking over his shoulder every few minutes. It took him less than 10 minutes to finish. When he stepped back, admiring his work, he felt the first real sense of satisfaction in days. In bright red spray paint, scrawled across the office windows, were the words, "Stay OFF my property." He took a picture, sent it to an anonymous tip line, and disappeared into the night. By morning, the message was everywhere. The Wells Development Group was furious. News outlets started asking questions. And most importantly, it sent a clear response to Danny Wells and whoever was backing him. Josh wasn't going anywhere. Later that day, Rebecca, a local real estate lawyer, called him. "You've stirred up a storm," she said, amusement in her voice. "What the hell are you doing?" "Making sure they know I'm not scared," Josh replied. Rebecca sighed. "That's great, but now you've got their full attention. You need to be careful." Josh nodded, gripping the phone. "I know. I just need to figure out who's really pulling the strings." Rebecca was silent for a moment. Then she said, "I might be able to help with that. Meet me tomorrow." I have something you'll want to see. Josh agreed, knowing that whatever Rebecca had found, it could change everything. The next morning, he met her at a quiet diner on the edge of town, a place far from the watchful eyes of Wells Development Group. Rebecca slid a folder across the table, her expression serious. Inside were documents, property records, and most importantly, financial transactions linking Danny Wells to someone even more powerful, Gerald Holt, a real estate mogul with a long history of shady deals. Holt wasn't just involved in land development. He was a known manipulator, someone who used legal loopholes and under-the-table agreements to push people out of their homes. Josh scanned the papers, his jaw tightening. So this isn't just about my property. They've been doing this all over the county. Rebecca nodded. They find places they want, drive down values, make life miserable for the owners, and when they finally sell, they flip the land for massive profits. Wells is just the frontman. Holt is the real mastermind. Josh exhaled slowly, running a hand through his hair. If Holt was involved, then this fight was much bigger than he had thought. Taking on Danny Wells had been one thing, but going after a man like Holt, that was a whole different battle. He leaned back in his seat, considering his next move. He couldn't go to the authorities. Not yet. If Holt had the kind of influence Rebecca claimed, then the system was probably already compromised. He needed to hit them in a way they couldn't ignore. Public exposure. Rebecca seemed to read his thoughts. I've already sent copies of these documents to a few investigative journalists. If we can get this into the news, Holt won't be able to hide behind his money. Josh nodded. Then let's make sure they can't bury this. That night, he took things a step further. He printed dozens of flyers, detailing the illegal deals, the forced evictions, and the names of those involved. Then, under the cover of darkness, he went through the neighborhoods affected by Holt's schemes, slipping the flyers into mailboxes, taping them to street poles, and making sure every resident knew the truth. By morning, the entire town was buzzing. Holt's name was suddenly everywhere, and he wasn't happy about it. The morning news ran a story about the shady land deals. Local residents began protesting, and social media was filled with anger toward Wells Development Group. Josh knew he had struck a nerve when, by mid-afternoon, a black sedan pulled up outside his house. A man in an expensive suit stepped out, his movements controlled, his expression blank. Josh met him on the porch, arms crossed, waiting for the inevitable speech. Mr. McKenzie, the man said smoothly. My name is Eric Marlowe. I represent Gerald Holt's interests. Josh didn't respond, just raised an eyebrow, waiting. Marlowe smiled, though it didn't reach his eyes. You've been making a lot of noise. We'd like to make you an offer. Josh chuckled. You already did. I said no. Marlowe's smile faltered slightly. That was before you started interfering with business matters. Holt is willing to be very generous if you walk away now. And if I don't? Josh asked. Marlowe's smile vanished. Then I'd suggest you be careful. You've made some powerful enemies. Josh held his gaze, unshaken. If you're here to threaten me, save your breath. I'm not going anywhere. Marlowe sighed, adjusting his cufflinks. I was hoping we could handle this peacefully. He reached into his pocket, pulled out a sleek envelope, and placed it on the porch railing. That's our final offer. I'd think it over if I were you. Then, without another word, he turned and walked back to his car, driving off without looking back. Josh picked up the envelope, already knowing what was inside. More money, a bigger number, a final bribe. He didn't even bother opening it. Instead, he tore it in half and let the pieces fall to the ground. That was Holt's last move. Now it was Josh's turn. Josh made a call to Rebecca, his mind set on taking things to the next level. They wanted to intimidate him, to buy him out, to make him disappear quietly, but he wasn't going to let that happen. When Rebecca answered, he got straight to the point. I want to escalate this, he said. Holt sent his people to threaten me, and I'm done waiting. Rebecca exhaled. I figured he would, she said. You sure you're ready for what comes next? Josh glanced at the torn envelope still sitting on his porch, then at the reinforced hedge that had started all of this. More than ready. Rebecca didn't argue. All right then, she said. I have a contact, someone who deals with corporate fraud cases. He's been looking into Holt for a while now, and with everything you've uncovered, we might have enough to push for a federal investigation. Josh's grip tightened on the phone. Let's do it. Within a few hours, Rebecca arranged a meeting. Josh found himself sitting across from a sharp-eyed man in a crisp government suit, a folder thick with evidence in front of him. The agent's name was Mark Henderson, and from the way he studied Josh, he wasn't here to waste time. "Mr. McKenzie," Henderson began, flipping through the documents. "What you've brought us is significant. Holt has been on our radar for a while, but we never had enough solid evidence to act. Until now." Josh nodded. "So what happens next?" Henderson closed the folder, his expression unreadable. "We need more. This is enough to open an investigation, but to make an arrest, we need something concrete. A paper trail, a direct connection, something that proves he's personally involved in these illegal deals." Josh sat back, considering. He knew exactly where to look. That night, instead of waiting for Holt's next move, Josh made one of his own. He parked a block away from the Wells Development Group office, waiting in the shadows until the last light went out. Then, moving carefully, he made his way around the back, where he knew the real information was stored. Breaking in wasn't the hard part, getting out with the right documents would be. Josh moved carefully, sticking to the shadows, avoiding the security cameras he had already mapped out days ago. Wells Development Group wasn't some high-security facility, but they weren't careless either. They had locks, motion sensors, and most likely, a security system linked to Holt's personal network. He reached the back entrance, pulled a thin tool from his pocket, and went to work. Within seconds, the door clicked open, and he was inside. The office was eerily quiet, the faint hum of electronics the only sound. Josh moved down the hallway, checking each door, looking for anything that screamed important. Then he found it, Denny Wells' office. The door was locked, but the security was basic. A few more seconds, and he was inside, shutting the door quietly behind him. He moved to the desk, flipping through folders, checking the computer screen for anything useful. Then, he found it, a thick file marked with Holt's initials. Inside were contracts, signed agreements, and financial records linking Holt directly to the land scams. This was it, the proof Henderson needed. Josh pulled out his phone, snapping quick photos, then tucked the documents into his jacket. He turned to leave, but the second he cracked the door open, he knew he had made a mistake. Footsteps, coming fast. Someone was here. He froze, heart pounding as the footsteps stopped just outside the office. A key rattled in the lock. Josh had seconds to decide. He scanned the room, spotted a supply closet, and slipped inside just as the door swung open. He held his breath, listening. Danny Wells' voice carried through the office, low but agitated. "I don't care what Holt said. We need to move faster. The McKenzie problem is only getting worse." Another voice responded, someone Josh didn't recognize. "You sure he doesn't have any backup? We can't afford any more attention." Wells sighed. "He's just a mechanic. He doesn't have the resources to stop us. We just need to push him a little harder." Josh clenched his jaw. They thought he was alone. They thought he was just some nobody in their way. He was going to prove them wrong. As soon as the office door closed again, Josh slipped out, gripping the stolen documents firmly. He moved quickly but carefully, retracing his path, making sure he left no evidence. Every second counted. If they realized the papers were missing before he got out, this would turn into a completely different kind of problem. He reached the rear exit, pushed the doorway open, and stepped into the cool air. No alarms. No shouts. Not yet. He made it back to his vehicle, slid inside, and started the ignition. Only after he had put a few blocks between himself and Wells Development Group did he finally relax. The documents were now in his possession, and they were enough to destroy Holt. He drove straight to Rebecca's office, where she was already waiting. The moment he dropped the bundle on her desk, she started flipping through the papers, her eyes widening. "This is it," she said. "This is the final proof." Josh leaned against the wall, arms crossed. "So what's the next step?" Rebecca picked up her cell phone. "I'm calling Henderson. We're taking this directly to the feds." Within an hour, they were sitting across from Henderson, who took one glance at the files and nodded. "This is enough," he said. "We'll get a court order and move on Holt before he can erase his tracks." Josh exhaled, feeling the first real sense of victory since this all began. It wasn't just about his land anymore. It was about stopping these people from doing this to anyone else. The next morning, The FBI raided Wells Development Group's headquarters. Josh watched the news from his kitchen, a steaming cup of coffee in hand as reporters covered the scene. Agents moved in and out of the building, carrying boxes of files, confiscating computers, and questioning employees who looked anxious. It was a satisfying sight. Danny Wells was led out in handcuffs, his expression a mix of shock and rage. Josh smirked, knowing Wells had never expected things to unravel this quickly. But the real moment of justice came when the cameras caught Gerald Holt being escorted from a different office, his lawyers trailing behind, trying to control the situation. Rebecca called him later that afternoon, her voice filled with relief. "They've got more than enough to prosecute," she said. "Holt and Wells are both looking at serious charges." Josh nodded, staring out at his yard, where his hedge still stood, untouched, exactly where it belonged. "So it's finally over?" "Almost," Rebecca replied. "They're pushing for a trial, but Holt's empire is collapsing. The homeowner association is already trying to distance themselves, and investors are pulling out. He won't be able to recover from this." Josh exhaled, letting the weight of the last few weeks finally start to lift. They had tried to force him out, to erase him from his own home, and in the end, they had destroyed themselves instead. That evening, Josh sat on his porch, watching the sunset, knowing his fight was finally won. The wind moved through the hedge, rustling the leaves, a quiet reminder of everything he had protected. He had faced powerful people, ones who thought they could control him, intimidate him, force him to surrender. But they had been wrong. He had stood his ground, and in the end, they had been the ones to fall. His phone buzzed beside him. It was Rebecca. "Just got word," she said. "Holt is trying to negotiate a plea deal. He knows there's no way out." Josh chuckled, shaking his head. "Let him rot." Rebecca laughed. "Enjoy the peace, Josh. You earned it." He hung up, set his phone down, and leaned back in his chair. For the first time in weeks, there was no tension, no waiting for the next move, no fear of what they might do next. He took a deep breath, letting the air fill his lungs, feeling the satisfaction of victory settle in his bones. This was his home, and no one was ever going to take it from him again.